Charles Langford was a man with power and wealth. At 70 years old, he had spent decades building his fortune and creating a successful life for his family. He lived in a large mansion, surrounded by luxury and all the things money could buy. But despite his riches, the most valuable thing in his life was control over his family, control over his business, and control over his legacy. On a cold evening in February, everything changed. Charles Langford was found dead in his study, slumped over his desk. At first it seemed like a natural death for a man his age. But soon, questions began to rise. There were bruises around his neck, and something about the way he died didn't seem right. Charles hadn't simply passed away, he had been murdered. The Langford family was immediately thrown into chaos. Charles' 3 children, William, Samantha, and Henry, each had their own reasons to feel bitter towards their father. Despite their luxurious upbringing, life in the Langford household was far from perfect. Charles' will, which would determine the future of his empire, was about to be read, and it could change everything. As investigators dug deeper, they found out that the relationships between the Langford family members were more complicated than they appeared. Each of them had secrets, and each had something to gain from their father's death. This is the story of a family torn apart by greed, secrets, and betrayal. The investigation into Charles Langford's death would uncover a tangled web of lies, leaving everyone wondering who would benefit the most from his murder, and how far would they go to get what they wanted. Charles Langford was a man of immense power and control. He had built his business empire from the ground up, shaping his fortune with hard work and a ruthless attitude. But along with the wealth came a strong desire to control every part of his life, including his family. His children, William, Samantha, and Henry, had grown up in the shadow of their father's strict rules and demands. Despite their privileged upbringing, the Langford children each had their own struggles, often feeling smothered by Charles' expectations. On a cold February evening, Charles was found dead in his study. His wife, Elizabeth, had gone to bed early, and it wasn't until the next morning that one of the staff discovered Charles slumped over his desk. At first it looked like he had suffered a heart attack, a common assumption for a man in his 70s, but when the paramedics arrived, they quickly noticed something unusual: bruises around his neck. Charles Langford had not died of natural causes, he had been strangled. The police were called, and Detective Sarah Miles, a seasoned investigator, was assigned to the case. She immediately realized that this was no ordinary murder. Charles had enemies in the business world, but his death seemed too personal, too deliberate. The investigation started at home, focusing on the people who knew Charles best: his family. The Langford mansion was large, elegant, and filled with expensive furniture and artwork. But beneath the polished surface, tensions had been brewing for years. Charles was not just a father to his children, he was their constant overseer. He dictated their lives, from their careers to their personal relationships. William, the eldest son, had followed in his father's footsteps, joining the family business, but he had never earned Charles' respect. Samantha, the eldest daughter, had become a lawyer, yet Charles criticized her every move, belittling her accomplishments. Henry, the youngest son, had rebelled the most, distancing himself from the family and pursuing his own interests, but even he couldn't escape Charles' influence. As the investigation unfolded, Detective Miles began to piece together the family dynamics. She discovered that Charles had recently updated his will, something that had caused quite a stir within the family. William had always believed he would inherit the majority of the estate, but the new will left much of the fortune to be divided equally among the 3 children, which didn't sit well with any of them. It created friction, with each sibling now seeing the other as competition. Detective Miles interviewed Elizabeth first. She was still in shock from the discovery of her husband's body, but her grief seemed genuine. Elizabeth had been married to Charles for over 40 years, and had learned to accept his controlling nature. Though she had her own frustrations with her husband, there was no clear motive for her to kill him. Still, the detective had to consider every possibility. Elizabeth claimed to have gone to bed early that night and heard nothing unusual. But in a house as large as theirs, it wasn't hard to imagine someone moving around unnoticed. Next, Detective Miles spoke with William. As the eldest, William had always been under the most pressure to live up to his father's expectations. He was a serious man, with a cold demeanor, and his strained relationship with his father was no secret. William admitted that he had never gotten along with Charles, but he denied any involvement in his death. However, his financial records told a different story. William had been struggling with debt after a series of failed investments, and inheriting the family fortune would have solved his problems. Samantha was the next to be interviewed. Unlike her brother, she had always tried to earn her father's approval, though it never seemed to be enough. Samantha was a successful lawyer, but Charles had constantly undermined her accomplishments, leaving her frustrated and bitter. She too had a motive, especially with the new will in place. Samantha was calm during her interview, insisting that she had no reason to harm her father. But there was something in her eyes that made Detective Miles question whether Samantha's loyalty to her family was as strong as she claimed. Henry, the youngest, was the hardest to track down. He had distanced himself from the family years ago, living a more carefree life. Unlike his siblings, Henry had never shown much interest in the family business or the inheritance. But that didn't mean he wasn't affected by Charles' death. When Detective Miles finally sat down with him, Henry seemed genuinely upset, but also guarded. He admitted that his relationship with his father had been strained for years, and while he claimed to have no interest in the inheritance, it was clear that he had his own reasons for resenting his father's control over his life. As Detective Miles continued to investigate, she uncovered more secrets within the family. Charles' new will had clearly created tension, but there was also evidence that he had been planning something bigger, something that could have shifted the family dynamics even more. Charles had been in talks to sell off a major part of the business, which would have left his children with far less than they had expected. This revelation only deepened the mystery, as it became clear that Charles' murder wasn't just about money, it was about control, power, and the lengths to which someone in his family was willing to go to escape his grasp. The investigation left Detective Miles with more questions than answers. Who stood to gain the most from Charles Langford's death? Was it one of his children, or was there something even more complicated going on within the family? The pieces were starting to come together, but the truth would prove to be more shocking than anyone could have imagined. As Detective Sarah Miles continued to dig deeper into the Langford family dynamics, she realized that the relationships between Charles and his children were much more complicated than they first appeared. The initial interviews had given her a glimpse into the tension that simmered beneath the surface, but there were still many unanswered questions. What had driven one of the family members to commit murder? And how had they hidden their involvement so well? The investigation shifted toward uncovering the secrets that the Langford family had kept hidden for years. Detective Miles started by focusing on William Langford, the eldest son. William had followed in his father's footsteps, taking a position of leadership in the family business. However, his financial troubles were a major red flag. With mounting debts and failed investments, William stood to gain the most from inheriting his father's fortune. But William's strained relationship with Charles was another important detail. For years, William had been desperate for his father's approval, but no matter how hard he worked, it was never enough. The new will, which divided the fortune equally among the 3 children, had angered William. He had always assumed that being the eldest and the one closest to the business, he would inherit the majority of the estate. The fact that his father had chosen to change this arrangement in his final months was deeply upsetting to him. Detective Miles began to wonder if this financial strain, combined with William's resentment toward his father, could have driven him to kill. But William wasn't the only one with motive. Samantha Langford, the eldest daughter, had her own complicated relationship with Charles. A successful lawyer, Samantha had always sought her father's validation, but like William, she had often been met with criticism instead of praise. Charles had undermined her achievements, calling her legal career a distraction from her real responsibilities to the family. For Samantha, her father's constant belittling had taken an emotional toll. The updated will had given her more financial security than she had expected, but it also highlighted the competition between her and her siblings. Samantha was ambitious, and she had the intelligence to pull off something as calculated as murder, but did she have the heart to kill her own father? Detective Miles continued to explore Samantha's life, talking to her colleagues and friends. The picture they painted of Samantha was of a woman under immense pressure. She had built a successful career, but it seemed that no matter what she achieved, she could never escape her father's shadow. Her friends recalled how Samantha had become more distant and frustrated in recent months, especially after learning about the changes to the will. This new perspective on Samantha's mental state added more fuel to the fire of suspicion. Then there was Henry, the youngest of the Langford children. Unlike William and Samantha, Henry had always distanced himself from the family business and the drama that surrounded it. He preferred a more carefree lifestyle, pursuing his own interests and largely ignoring his father's demands. On the surface, Henry seemed the least likely to have committed the murder. He hadn't shown much interest in the inheritance, and his relationship with his father, while distant, hadn't been as filled with conflict as his siblings. But as the investigation continued, Henry's alibi for the night of the murder became less convincing. Henry had told Detective Miles that he had spent the evening out with friends, but when the detective interviewed those friends, their stories didn't match up. There were inconsistencies in the timeline, and none of the friends could confirm Henry's whereabouts for several hours on the night of the murder. This gap in time made Henry a more serious suspect than Detective Miles had initially thought. Was Henry involved in the murder after all, or was he covering for someone else in the family? As Detective Miles pieced together the various clues, she began to suspect that the motive for Charles Langford's murder wasn't solely about money. While the will had created tension among the siblings, there seemed to be deeper issues at play. Charles had ruled over his family with an iron fist, controlling their lives for decades. His children had all suffered under his domineering presence, and each had their own reasons for wanting to escape his influence. The discovery of more evidence from Charles' personal files added a new twist to the case. Detective Miles found documents showing that Charles had been planning to sell off parts of the family business. This move would have drastically reduced the inheritance that his children expected to receive, potentially leaving them with far less than they had anticipated. This revelation deepened the mystery, as it meant that all three of the Langford children stood to lose if Charles had lived long enough to finalize the sale. As the investigation progressed, the tension within the Langford family only grew. Each sibling was suspicious of the others, and their once close-knit bond began to unravel. Detective Miles knew that the truth was somewhere within this tangled web of family secrets, but she still didn't have enough evidence to make an arrest. Every piece of information pointed to a different suspect, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to determine who had the most to gain from Charles Langford's death. The deeper Detective Miles dug, the more complicated the case became. It was clear that someone in the family had murdered Charles, but was it a premeditated plan carried out by one person, or had more than one member of the family been involved? The answers were still out of reach, but one thing was certain: the Langford family had been hiding more than anyone had imagined, and the truth was about to come to light. As the investigation into Charles Langford's murder deepened, Detective Sarah Miles knew she was getting closer to uncovering the truth. The family's secrets had started to unravel, and every new piece of evidence pointed to more complex motives than anyone had first imagined. Each member of the Langford family seemed to have something to hide, and the deeper she dug, the more it became clear that someone in the family had planned this murder for reasons far beyond just money. Detective Miles turned her attention to Elizabeth Langford, Charles' widow. Though she had been ruled out as a suspect early on due to her weak alibi and seemingly genuine grief, Miles couldn't ignore the fact that Elizabeth had been married to a controlling man for over 40 years. Elizabeth had spent most of her life under Charles' thumb, tolerating his harsh rules and his dominance over the family. It was no secret that Elizabeth had grown tired of being in his shadow. The couple had argued frequently in recent years, particularly about the future of the family business and Charles' overbearing treatment of their children. Digging into Elizabeth's past, Detective Miles uncovered something surprising. Elizabeth had secretly consulted a divorce lawyer months before Charles' death. Though she never followed through with the divorce, it became clear that she had been considering a way out of the marriage. Elizabeth had also been quietly securing her own financial independence, something Charles would have never approved of. While this raised some questions, there was no concrete evidence linking Elizabeth to the murder. Still, Miles couldn't shake the feeling that Elizabeth knew more than she was letting on. As the investigation continued, one of the most troubling pieces of evidence was uncovered in the form of an email trail between Charles and an outside business partner. Charles had been planning to sell off key parts of the Langford empire to streamline the business. This move would have left his children with significantly less than they had anticipated. For William, Samantha, and Henry, this would have been a disaster. The timing of these emails suggested that Charles was just weeks away from finalizing the deal, meaning that his death conveniently stopped the sale and left the entire estate in his children's hands. William, who had been struggling with massive debts, stood to lose the most from this sale. The police had already discovered his financial troubles, but now it was clear just how desperate he had been. His attempts to hide his debts from his father had failed, and Charles had made it clear that William wouldn't be bailed out again. In fact, Charles had begun freezing access to certain accounts, further complicating William's situation. This new information strengthened the theory that William had the strongest motive for wanting his father dead before the sale could be completed. But then came another unexpected twist. A series of deleted messages between Henry and a close family friend were recovered from Henry's phone. In these messages, Henry expressed his growing frustration with his family, specifically calling out his father's manipulation and control. Though Henry had always seemed to care less about the family business than his siblings, the messages revealed a deep-seated resentment toward his father, who had pressured him to conform to the family's rigid expectations. Henry had spent years distancing himself from the Langford name, but the recent discovery of the impending business sale had reignited his anger. He felt betrayed, believing that his father had planned to leave him with nothing. This discovery made Henry a more prominent suspect. He had no interest in the business itself, but the idea that his father would further reduce his inheritance, leaving him financially unstable, could have been the final push. However, there was still no clear evidence tying Henry to the actual crime. He had been evasive during his interviews, but so far, nothing placed him at the scene of the murder. At this point, Detective Miles was juggling multiple suspects, each with their own motives. The Langford family had been hiding behind a carefully constructed image for years, but that image was now shattered. All three siblings had reasons to want their father dead. William had his financial troubles, Samantha had her frustrations with her father's control over her career, and Henry had his resentment of being pushed away from the family's expectations. Then, a breakthrough came in the form of forensics. After a second examination of the crime scene, small traces of a drug were found in Charles' bloodstream. It was a prescription medication that Charles had not been taking. This raised a crucial question: had someone drugged him before the murder to make it easier to kill him? Detective Miles suspected that whoever killed Charles may have given him the drug to weaken him, making it easier to strangle him without a struggle. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but there was still one critical question left to answer: who had access to this drug, and how had it been administered to Charles before his death? Miles was now certain that the murder had been premeditated, carefully planned by someone close to Charles. The discovery of the drug shifted the investigation in a new direction, bringing the family closer to the truth. With the discovery of the drug in Charles Langford's system, Detective Sarah Miles knew she was getting closer to solving the murder. The drug had been used to weaken Charles, making it easier to kill him without a struggle. This shifted the case from what could have been seen as a spontaneous act of violence to a premeditated murder. Whoever killed Charles had planned it carefully, taking steps to ensure that he wouldn't be able to fight back. The next step for the investigation was to figure out who had access to the drug. After some digging, Detective Miles found that it was a prescription medication often used to treat anxiety and muscle tension. None of the Langford family members had prescriptions for it, but someone must have been able to get their hands on it. That led the detective to search for anyone in the family's inner circle who had access to medications or could have used connections to obtain it. Miles' focus shifted back to Elizabeth Langford. While Elizabeth didn't have a prescription for the drug, it was discovered that one of her close friends, a doctor, had easy access to it. This friend had been regularly visiting the Langford home over the past few months. Elizabeth's relationship with this friend raised eyebrows, as the two had been meeting more frequently, especially during the period leading up to Charles' death. Could Elizabeth have been working with her friend to get the drug without raising suspicion? This new lead added another layer of complexity to the case. However, Elizabeth wasn't the only one with access to the drug. Further investigation revealed that William Langford had made several large withdrawals from his bank account in the weeks before the murder. While this wasn't directly tied to purchasing the drug, it raised questions about where the money had gone and what William had been spending it on. The timing of these withdrawals seemed too convenient, happening right around the time the drug was introduced into Charles' system. Meanwhile, Henry's role in the family continued to puzzle Detective Miles. On the surface, he seemed like the least involved, often staying out of family business matters. But Henry's alibi, which had already shown cracks, was proving to be more unreliable as the investigation went on. His friends had started to change their stories, and it became clear that Henry had been hiding something. One of Henry's close friends finally admitted that Henry had been acting strange in the days leading up to Charles' death. He had been asking about how certain drugs work, specifically ones that could cause drowsiness or make someone more vulnerable. This revelation put Henry squarely back in the spotlight. Samantha Langford, though seemingly the most stable of the siblings, was also under scrutiny. She had the intelligence and the resources to carry out such a calculated plan. Samantha's legal background made her well aware of the consequences of murder, and she had the expertise to cover her tracks. However, there was little direct evidence pointing to her involvement in obtaining or using the drug. Still, Samantha's growing frustration with her father's control and her rivalry with William over the inheritance could not be ignored. As all of these pieces came together, Detective Miles knew she was dealing with a complex family conspiracy. The Langford children each had their own reasons for wanting their father dead, and Elizabeth's growing dissatisfaction with her marriage added even more motive. The drug had been introduced into Charles' system by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, but whether it was Elizabeth, William, Henry, or even Samantha was still unclear. The investigation turned back to the timeline of the night Charles was killed. Detective Miles went over the details once more, focusing on the small windows of opportunity that each family member had. It became evident that the murder wasn't a solo act. The drug, the planning, and the execution all pointed to the fact that more than one person had been involved. The key to solving the case was in figuring out how the family members had worked together, whether knowingly or not. Detective Miles now suspected that the murder was the result of a collective effort, each person playing their part, either willingly or through manipulation. The final question was who had orchestrated it all. Someone had taken charge of the plan, ensuring that Charles would be eliminated in a way that looked clean, almost natural. But with the discovery of the drug, that plan had begun to unravel. Detective Miles was getting closer to the truth, but she knew that the final pieces of the puzzle would reveal a betrayal much deeper than anyone could have imagined. The Langford family had been torn apart by greed, power, and long-held grudges. The Langford murder investigation had reached its final stage. With the pieces of the puzzle slowly coming together, Detective Sarah Miles knew she was on the verge of exposing the truth behind Charles Langford's death. The discovery of the drug in his system, the family's fractured relationships, and the growing evidence all pointed to a carefully orchestrated murder. But the final step was figuring out who had led the plan and how the family members were involved. After weeks of piecing together the evidence, it became clear to Detective Miles that the murder wasn't the work of one person. Each family member had a role to play, but the ringleader had been hiding in plain sight. Elizabeth Langford, Charles' wife, had been the mastermind behind the murder. She had grown tired of Charles' controlling nature, his overbearing influence on their children, and his constant manipulation. The divorce she had once considered was no longer enough. Elizabeth had decided to take control of her life in a way that would free her from Charles and secure her future. Elizabeth had enlisted the help of her children without them fully realizing what was happening. Each child had their own motives: William's financial struggles, Samantha's need for independence, and Henry's resentment, but Elizabeth had orchestrated everything. She knew how to push each child just enough to make them feel they were acting on their own, when in fact, they were all part of her larger plan. The drug found in Charles' system had been obtained through Elizabeth's close friend, the doctor who regularly visited the house. Elizabeth had quietly acquired the drug and slipped it into Charles' drink on the night of the murder. This weakened him, making it easy for Elizabeth to carry out the next part of her plan. But she wasn't alone in the actual act of killing Charles. She had manipulated William into believing that his father's death was the only way out of his financial troubles. William, desperate and backed into a corner, had confronted his father that night, unaware that Charles had already been drugged. When Charles began to struggle, weakened by the medication, William had panicked and used the opportunity to strangle his father. He had believed it was his only chance to free himself from his father's control. Elizabeth, watching from the shadows, had allowed her son to take the fall, knowing she had set everything up perfectly. Henry and Samantha, while not directly involved in the murder, had played their parts as well. Elizabeth had sown seeds of discontent between them and their father, fueling their anger and resentment. Both of them had been kept in the dark about the full extent of the plan, but they had unknowingly contributed to the tense atmosphere that Elizabeth needed to carry out her plan. In the end, they had been pawns in a game they didn't even know they were playing. Detective Miles confronted Elizabeth with the evidence, and it was only then that the full truth came out. Elizabeth, calm and collected, admitted that she had grown tired of living in Charles' shadow. She had spent her entire life being controlled by him, watching him manipulate their children and the people around them. She had decided that enough was enough. By orchestrating the murder, she had not only freed herself but had also secured the future of her children, at least in her mind. William, overwhelmed with guilt, confessed to his part in the crime. He hadn't known about the drug or the full extent of his mother's plan, but he realized too late that he had been manipulated. Henry and Samantha, devastated by the betrayal, struggled to come to terms with their mother's actions. The family had been destroyed by the very person they had trusted most. In the end, Elizabeth Langford was arrested for masterminding the murder of her husband. William, though involved in the act, received a lighter sentence due to the role Elizabeth had played in manipulating him. Henry and Samantha were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered family, forever changed by the crime that had torn them apart. As the case closed, Detective Miles reflected on how deeply hidden the truth had been. The Langford family had appeared to be wealthy and powerful, but beneath the surface, they had been torn apart by greed, control, and manipulation. The murder of Charles Langford had been the result of years of resentment building up, finally erupting in a plan that ended in betrayal and death. The investigation was over, but the scars left behind by the Langford murder would take much longer to heal. The family's dark secrets had been exposed, and nothing would ever be the same again.